With the mindset forward, I think they are providing thought and action.
Thank you. Messages from the President. Announcements by the Speaker.
Honourable members, by way of announcement, I'd like to firstly say that personally I'd like to thank every member of the House who shared in Mr. in the family's bereavement and the family of Mr. Barker. And particularly I'd like to thank the clerk.
Go ahead, sir. I was just looking over these guidelines. They seem pretty fair, but I was concerned about number 17.
That is regards to members of the public, not to the members of the Senate. Sorry, I should have made that clear. Number 17 pertains to members of the public and to the press. They're not to participate in any way in our debates. In the past, we've had members of the public trying to gesticulate, to point out, to intervene, and to even heckle. And so this is, I can't stop you from heckling, and I wouldn't attempt to do so.
No,
so this is for members of the public. So
I was just concerned that you had a spirited debate.
No, we wouldn't in any way try to curtail and circumscribe that. Thank you. Thank you. Please, Ms. Ali, I recognize Ms. Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, reference the very guidelines. I'd like you to address your mind also back to item number 5.
Item number 5 states, honourable members, that the Honourable Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and the Honourable Minister of Finance, when he is replying, will not be subject to time restrictions. Will not be subject to time restrictions.
Mr. Speaker, could I have an explanation why for winding up the debate, why is it the Honorable Prime Minister has to fall into the category of the opposition leader and the finance minister?
Because Ms. Ali, the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. It has the leader of government business, and it has been the tradition of this House. That is the tradition I met 16 years ago when I came, and I see no difficulty. It is our Prime Minister. So, thank you. Any other matter for clarification for our business? All the members, there are 10 speakers for today. One set of visitors. And as stated, we are going to do our best to have us leave here at 10. I would like to go, and I'm sure my Deputy Speaker shares my view that he would also like to leave at 10 p.m. So even though I put that he'll take over, I know that he doesn't want to take over. So we'll do our best to stay within the time so that we can have a good, healthy, robust debate. And as I said, these are guidelines which of course we will seek to adopt, hopefully not too much as we go ahead. Proceed, please, Mr. Isaac.
Introduction of bills.
All the members are advised that the bill that should have been presented today will not be presented by the Honourable Minister of Natural Resources and the Environment. Thank you. Proceed.
Public business, government's business.
Honourable members, we will now commence the debate on the 2014 budget and the consideration of the estimates later on by the Committee of Supply. We will, in respect of sitting times, follow our usual practice, and I have to amend my note. We will break at 5 p.m. prompt for 1 hour, and I've asked the Sergeant at Arms to ensure that we stay within that time and continue thereafter. Our first speaker today is the Honourable Carl Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, especially for giving me my full to start by making a very personal word, say a very personal word in passing concerning the loss of my erstwhile neighbor and and shield often. Never mind the fact that she spent a lot of the time sitting next to me, accusing me of stealing her papers and documents. I did indeed manage to forgive her, and I'd just like to express my own sadness at her loss. Mr. Speaker, I should like, in keeping with the tradition in the House, to also extend congratulations to the Minister of Finance for presenting another annual budget to this Assembly. He has, well, I don't know what that means, he has done so in a climate of anxiety on the part of the populace, and judging from their silence and subdued mood on the part of his colleagues on that side of the House also. Ladies and gentlemen, the challenges facing Guyana, I believe, have been very extensively aired, especially in the last year or so on the economic front, perhaps more loudly and frequently than at any other time in the recent past. It appears, however, that the priorities that should inform the preparation of budgets and overall economic planning are not perhaps shared in a consensual manner as they should be. And so I'd like to start by pointing to this area and saying a few words on this with a view to trying to see if one can ensure that at least on the other side of the House, it is clearly understood where we stand. The election of 2011 yielded a result, Mr. Speaker, that left, I think, few of us really satisfied. And although on this side of the House an overall majority exists in terms of the number of seats, the manner in which those seats are allocated, I don't think so. Whether we like it or not, the electorate decided not to place in the hands of a single party a majority. And that has the effect, obviously, I think everyone else would see it as constraining the power of the executive and its representative in this House. And the significance of that outcome in relation to some sections of the electorate is, of course, often a topic for debate over drinks and elsewhere. But the simple fact is that with not a majority of votes in the hands of the governing party, the business of the House has to be a matter that is undertaken on the basis of some understanding or common understanding on both sides. And if the government's program is to be implemented, it needs alliances or at least compromises over the program that the government would seek to implement. And to conclude that simply because a party has the largest single number of seats, it deserves to be able to pass all the legislation it wishes and to behave as though it is in control of the Assembly is the source of the so-called, what the Honourable Minister described as a graphic parliamentary impasse. I thought that it was important not to allow this matter to pass, Mr. Speaker, because clearly, if we treat that impasse as some aberration, some mistake by the electorate that can be fixed simply by drawing to the attention of the fact that on the other side of the benches we have a set of honorable and efficient people, we are not going to get anywhere. In a democracy, the expressed views of the electorate cannot be wished away as though they were an error in arithmetic. And as regards the procedure that we use, I want to say that the reference I made to Mrs. Bakker just now, I'm reminded that she used to very often speak to this question of the arithmetic that the election itself generates, and would often, I think, in deference to Mr. Mansur Nadir, cite a comment he liked to make that as regards this side of the House, when you have a minority of seats, you can, I think the expression is that we could have our say and the government could have its day. It is a question of arithmetic in the end, and we should try to work to that rather than treating the consequence as a result of some devilish behavior on the part of those on this side of the bench. So the thing is, I want to say that the Constitution itself does not qualify or circumscribe the term majority. When it's a majority of one, the House exercises the same rules as to whether it's a majority of 40. Unless, of course, in specific circumstances, and those circumstances require a 2/3 majority or a referendum. That, I think, is something we have to try and live with. I mention it because quite frequently I hear on the other side complaints that the members on this side are exercising somehow some undemocratic rights because they only have a majority of one. And I think that is most unfortunate. And it reminds me of an observation by Ronald Reagan some time ago. He's not my favorite person, but that he says that governments exist to protect us from each other. And where government has gone beyond its limits is in deciding to protect us from ourselves. And I think that is a very valuable bit of information that we should bear in mind. The other point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is that the PPP government recognized the need to try and deal with the fact that you need some sort of consensus in this House. And initially, we had efforts at a tripartite set of discussions. The first set of discussions didn't go very far, although as a result of a crisis immediately before the Committee of Supply met in 2012, the government conceded on a number of issues in order to bring the debt up. And that, well, I say a number of issues, but it was specifically on the issue of old age pensions. I mentioned that simply to point out, Mr. Speaker, that the parties were engaged in discussions which threw up many, many issues, all of which were recognized as important, and around which a consensual program or core of policies could well have been crafted. The governing side didn't agree, and in the end, the issues were examined in a preliminary manner, and there seemed to be some understanding that we would take them up in the distant future to try to resolve them. I mention these again, Mr. Speaker, so that I can get the opportunity to remind you, to the extent that we have been discussing on these two sides of the House important issues. Many of those important issues seem to have died after the discussion took place. Perhaps a failure to recognize that in that list of issues were goals that at least a significant proportion of the representatives of the people, as the majority in this House represents, thought that they were worthy of attention and worthy of some more explicit consideration. Very quickly, let me say to you that in the list of 2012 that had been passed to the government and that we had discussions on were the following: the discussion on VAT and the Berbice Bridge toll, the question of old age pensions and public assistance, not only the increase in those, but a significant increase which we thought should have been implemented, the question of the subsidies to Linden, Kokwani, GPL and Gaisuko, the question of the public service salaries, across the board increases, as well as arrangements for the implementation of transparent mechanisms relating to the appointment of REOs, DREOs, and the issues about the management and modernization of the public service, questions of raising the public service retirement age, depressed areas development fund, the burning question of the NIS and its its impending financial collapse, its lack of financial viability at the moment, which the actuary continues to draw our attention to. The issue of GCOM and the constitutional offices and the way that the revenues for the resources for those agencies are captured in the estimates, in other words, the need to amend the estimates as currently presented. And in there were also the question of NCN and GINA and the Auditor General. NISIL was the 10th item. As following those aborted discussions, Mr. Speaker, the government and the opposition had, or as a result of those, had some broad agreement on some of these matters. It was agreed, for example, that the NIS position or the response of the government to the actuarial recommendations of the NIS would be submitted to this House by November of 2012, given its importance. Up to today, we haven't seen that. On the VAT issue, the government undertook to set up a tax reform committee and to examine ways to share more equitably the tax burden and to ensure or to see whether there are any possibilities for reducing the VAT in one way or the other, if only to look at questions of the zero rating and so forth. That has not happened. And also, on the tableau that we had discussions on were a number of constitutional issues, some of which arose from the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act and its conflict with the Constitution itself, especially as regards Article 222A of the Constitution. In the subsequent year, namely 2013 rather, we went through a discussion as per 2012 in a bid to try to find some common ground and to agree a process that would cause us to avoid or try to ensure that we avoid these impasses and the sorts of depression sometimes which captures the populace when we approach budget time, whether a crisis is going to beset all of us. And arising out of those exchanges in November, the party leaders on this side, separately and collectively, wrote to the President, again on a number of issues, 11 on this occasion, ranging from across the board salary increases, the question of frequency licenses, the government's commitments to the issue of licenses to the TV station in Region 10, a status report regarding the transfers requested by Guy Supo and GPL, and an update upon the plans that would enable them to get out of the situation of constantly calling on us for subsidies. They were called upon, the government was called upon to reconstitute the Tax Reform Committee, and also the question of constituting the Public Procurement Commission, to establish an Integrity Commission, Human Rights Commission, and a number of the other commissions which were not properly established. There was also the request in that letter concerning the extra budgetary agencies, including NISIL. And again, the question of the NIS arose, and the implementation of the actuarial report, actuarial recommendations. There was, again, the toll on Berbice Harbour Bridge, and the question of political dialogue and constitutional reforms, and a call again for the re-establishment of the institution of arrangements so that we can put in place a professional public service. And also the question of dealing with contract employees. I needn't say, Mr. Speaker, that in the budgets between 2012 and now, none of these matters have been properly addressed, let alone reflected in the budget document itself. And in recognition of the dissatisfaction that this had caused, on April the 17th of last year, the President, in a meeting with Mr. Granger and Mr. Granger's team, agreed on an exchange of letters between the Minister of Finance and myself, which would set out a process which would help us towards dealing in a more orderly manner with the pre-budget discussions. And that letter, whilst initially we thought it might be the trigger for ensuring that at least this process is started after so many false starts, has also failed. Only the APNU attended the sole meeting that was convened, and at that meeting the proposals that were submitted were really not discussed, and no letters were exchanged as part of the commitment that had been made. The point I'm wanting to make, Mr. Speaker, is that the government is in receipt both of proposals pertaining to a budget that could capture consensus across the aisles, as well as a process that could serve as a blueprint for dealing with the budget discussions and some form of the preparation in future. But in spite of these efforts, we come to the budget of 2014 without really having gone anyway significant towards dealing with the challenges that gave rise to the concerns in the first instance. And I draw your attention, Mr. Speaker, to the consequences, because in dealing with the budgets in the past, we've had cause to cut the allocations requested by the Minister for a variety of agencies. I'm thinking here of the monies pertaining to the commissions, the NC and GINA conundrum, and the considerations that arose in implementing those cuts. It's worthwhile saying that amongst the conditions that were raised here, especially since, Mr. Speaker, in dealing with this in a letter pertaining to whether the estimates were properly before the House, you had asked for an explanation of what were the conditions governing, if you like, the decision of the House. I know we deal with that elsewhere, but just to say to you that we had called for a cultural and social audit and for the adherence of these agencies to internationally accepted professional reporting standards, as well as a copy of the report on the wrongdoing within NCN in 2012. We had a number of other areas, the conditions pertaining to the transfers to GPL under the electrification program, issues pertaining to contracts for some of the major projects of the government, including the specialty hospital, the problem of the LCDS, and the issue of Amaili Falls and the refusal of the House to approve the equity contribution that the government had requested in that regard, and we had also had cause to cut an element associated with the International Airport at Timeri. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going through these simply because I want to extend our deliberations today, but I want to say to you that if we are aware that we have taken certain routes in the past, and the efforts to try and ensure that we don't end up in a cul-de-sac after these exchanges, after these efforts, then we really need to seriously pay attention to establishing modalities for dealing with difficulties that the majority identifies in relation to the government's program. And at the moment, it is the case that no mechanism exists for that. And I want to just give warning to my colleagues, Chairman, Speaker, that, for example, in the manner in which the estimates have been formulated, as I had written to you last year, April, indicating we are still of the view, which you confirmed in your ruling, that the format of the estimates as presented to this House were not consistent with the constitutional requirements. Now that has implications because I am recommending to my colleagues that they stand on that principle. In other words, the government has an obligation to honor its constitutional obligations, and we have an obligation also to ensure that they are held to those rules and they don't just break the rules because a minister or someone on the other side believes that they don't have to be bound by rules. So that is the reason for drawing these matters to your attention, Mr. Speaker, and for drawing them to the attention of my colleagues. As we look at the budget of 2014, we see that some of the broader issues that have been identified in our exchanges, again, tend not to be adequately treated. Let me look at the ones mentioned by those mentioned by the Minister himself in his presentation, and I think one can have no difficulty with this, but it's useful to know where the fashion of it, those who fashion the budget make their emphasis. I'm not attempting to list these in any order, or the order that the Minister cited them, but there were a range of broader goals at the opening section of the budget, ranging from aspirations for home ownership, raising levels of technical and professional qualifications, trying to pursue education for a better quality of life, access to decent public health care system, and the fact that, or the hope, that every family should have good reason for being optimistic about the future and should be motivated and incentivized for personal fulfillment and upward mobility. These are, I think, wonderful goals. We know, of course, that especially as regards, for example, the question of optimism about the future, that at least the most recent survey I looked at amongst youngsters leaves us in a very, and a place very far from optimism, because all of those youngsters between the ages of primary school and 25 would want to leave the country if they could have an opportunity, either immediately or within 5 to 10 years ahead. And it is a serious matter. This is one of the reasons why we should try to ensure that we can find common ground and move forward in a manner that is constructive. So we are pleased to see those goals. We are also wanting to say, Mr. Speaker, that we would have liked to see some others, many of which loom very large in cutting waste and corruption. Yes, very large. Amongst them is cutting waste and corruption, the question of the quality of government services, the problem of emoluments and conditions of service, the regulatory regimes, especially as regards the financial and other sectors, the maintenance of mechanisms to protect the poor and the vulnerable, putting in place an adequate analytical framework and benchmarks to enable the target setting and monitoring of some of the very goals that the Minister has mentioned. It is interesting that in a number of the areas, when you look at the proposals, broad though they are, clearly they're very desirable. But what worries me is that it is unlikely that we are able, in a hurry, to provide a background that could tell us where exactly we are in relation to some of the areas that are mentioned, even in terms of the facilities or the initiatives taken by the government in the past in regards to some areas such as employment and employment among youth and so forth. So the issue is, have we got a wide enough set of goals set out in the background that informs the policy making for budgets and the financial plans? And are we taking account of the need to ensure that the data that would be available to help us to undertake the analysis is in place? And I think these issues are especially urgent given growing evidence of income inequality in our society to an extent, I think, largely unprecedented, or at least unprecedented in most of our lifetimes. The question of the minister, for example, in making his presentation, took the opportunity in the opening to speak about the achievements that have been made since 2002, when this parliament started its session. And he listed a number of these areas, especially looking at how much was spent on a range of services. But you know, Mr. Speaker, at the end of that exercise, we still have to ask ourselves whether in fact the expenditures, large though they may have been, whether they have had the impact that was intended. And impact is something that is very much missing in terms of the analysis and the presentation of the 2014 budget. So I'll turn now to the 3 or 4 points that follow from these points I've been making earlier. The drafters of the 2014 budget have deliberately ignored the legal and constitutional issues raised in the earlier exchanges over the budget. The APNU proposes to have these matters brought to the fore. Secondly, in view of the debates that have taken place on a number of fronts, Mr. Speaker, whether it is on LCDS, the state of play in relation to Amalia, and so forth, that and GINA and NCN, that these debates seem not to have been taken into account, and we see almost what is a contemptuous inclusion of items in the budget, notwithstanding the fact that in the earlier debates, the House had called upon the ministers responsible for these sectors to present to it evidence before they would be prepared, or information before they would be prepared to approve monies for these areas. Mr. Speaker, I would like to single out for treatment at this stage the request for funds for Gaisuko. I note that the minister has in passing made reference to what he called a promised soon to be appointed board of directors and senior management. I note that not a word about the where special attention, to which special attention has always been paid by certainly the governments that I've been part of in the past. Our position has, let me say for those that may have some difficulty with economics, that we have provided considerable support to the sector in the past. And those of you that know a little bit about devaluation should understand that the devaluations of the 1980s had a lot to do with providing Guyana dollar resources to the main net earner of foreign exchange so that they could show a profit in Guyana dollar terms. So if you don't know, ask. Don't be as though you know what you're saying. It is clear, Mr. Speaker, that an industry which is important also deserves and needs to ensure that when monies are requested on behalf of its workers, to ensure that arrangements and plans are in place to ensure that the injection of money actually goes towards fixing the problems that gave rise to the difficulties in the first instance. The examination of the work done in relation to both the bauxite and to GPL are the same. That is, that they are important enough to warrant financial assistance, but that the financial assistance should be conditional on the government showing that it understood and it had made arrangements to remedy the difficulties that had got them in hot water in the first place. We have called for medium and long-term plans, and when those plans have been provided, even before the period has been completed, the industry or the company has gone off track. And that is the case of Gaisupo and the others. There's no point shouting sugar workers, because the problem is not the sugar workers, the problem is the government. The problem arises because of the government's policy. A policy which seeks to fill the board with a whole set of political appointees, a problem which seeks to appoint managers who are afraid of their own shadow. And your own MP over there, Gabu representative, has spoken to this body, and we agree with him in its entirety that Gabu's analysis of the weakness of the sugar sector is accurate. We agree with it. And the government must fix those things before they come to power. That's what we say.
Honorable, your time is up. An extension is required.
I will be given 15 minutes to continue his presentation.
Thank you. Proceed, Mr. Burnett. Proceed, Mr. Burnett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Gabu has a long list of management and policy inadequacies which is drawn to the attention of the government and the world over the last 5 or more years. And what we say is that those complaints should be addressed. And in the longer term, Gaisupo itself, and I must say, Mr. Speaker, in wearing a previous hat, I had funded a study on Gaisupo and its future and how it would survive in the liberalized EU market. And that called upon the industry not only to improve its efficiency, but to diversify into higher value products. And that has also to be part of the plan. That has to be part of the plan, and we agree to that. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable, Mr. Speaker, thank you. The Honorable, what is your
Make a presentation, please.
Mr. Speaker, the sectoral developments that we have seen set out in the budget leave us cold in many ways. Let me take bauxite. I noticed that the Minister made mention of a transshipment and dry docking facility to be constructed in Trinidad and Tobago, presumably at Point Lisas. This, for us, is a puzzle because we had a facility there before. It turned out to be uneconomic in the 1980s, largely because of the low volume of throughput. The industry, therefore, developed a plan which they implemented and which saved money to the tune of $3 to $4 US per ton. It involved the construction of a turning basin or dock at the mouth of the Demerara River, and this operated until '96. Later, Reynolds itself built a facility in the Berbice River, and they were, I should say, producing larger volumes than the BCGI and Rusal is now producing. And like Guyana and Bidco, they ruled out the Trinidad option. So it is somewhat of a puzzle to understand how it is that Guyana has gone to that particular proposal. The maintenance of that facility, or the attempt to establish a facility in Trinidad, seems not to be well-founded. And I think we would be interested in knowing what underlies that proposal. Secondly, I see there is a proposal for Kukurubuka deposit at this stage. And as regards that particular proposal, I should say that the experience here is that when you look at the note, you get the impression that this is an expansion of bauxite production, which is going to have a major impact on employment. But in fact, of course, it is actually the establishment of a facility to replace the depleted reserves at Kokwani. So it is not, in fact, additional production, and it should not, in a sense, be portrayed in that manner. I would like to say, Mr. Speaker, that in looking at the budget, there are two more points I'd like to make. First of all, that in looking at the figures, especially at the estimates and the various economic balances, one cannot avoid the impression that many of the figures have been doctored in order to facilitate balance. If you look at both revenue and expenditures, you will see that. And that, I think, is a matter that must concern us. The last point I'd like to make, Mr. Speaker, pertains to this claim that this budget is the largest budget ever. You know, Mr. Speaker, when a budget comes to the House, you have one figure. In the following year, that figure is revised. And in the year after that, the figure is settled as the final figure. If you have a look, Mr. Speaker, the budget 2013, which was billed as the largest budget ever. In 2014, the 208.4 billion, which was the largest ever, actually turned out to be 165.8 billion. In fact, in a revenue sense, it was smaller than the previous year. It was smaller than the previous year. And if you look at it on the expenditure side, it wasn't much different. Take either. So the significance of the size of the budget turns upon when it is that you're actually looking up at it. But the other side is the economics of it. If you think that it is so wonderful to have as large a budget as possible, the limit on the size of the budget is given by gross domestic product. And when you follow the minister's and his colleagues' presentations, Mr. Speaker, you get the impression that
allow Mr. Greenwich, allow Mr. Greenwich to speak, please. I'm having difficulty hearing him. Go ahead. Sorry. I'm having difficulty hearing Mr. Greenwich. Go ahead.
Tremendous joy and celebration would follow on the announcement that the budget was the largest it could ever be. In other words, it was taking all the gross domestic product. What it means, in fact, Mr. Speaker, when this budget gets larger and larger, is that it is taking a larger share of the income that you earn. And ultimately, the budget limitation is the total bundle of goods and services that are produced. So the point I'm making, Mr. Speaker, is that the significance of a larger budget has to be seen in the context of the share of income, of your income, that it takes, not in terms of the absolute size of money spent in any particular year. And that issue is a very important one, because the share of the budget and the management of the resources that the government garners has given rise to problems in this country before. And it reminds me that we should also bear that in mind when we seek to stop this House from modifying the amounts requested by the minister for funding, because it turns upon the whole principle of taxation and taxation without representation. That is why one has a right to look at and amend those figures so that they're consistent with the will of the majority. Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much.